Whereas he just pulls it out of his hat somehow. And I think that is I don't know if it's relevant here, but I think it's relevant in many communities. It wouldn't have to be done on every decision, even if it wasn't done on every decision. Like certain things can't be done that way. Our topics of halakhic infertility, right? They can't be handled that way, obviously. So you're not going to say couples problems with halakhic infertility in front of the whole community. But if you took on certain cases, even if the Rav of the community had the prerogative to decide which things he was going to present to the community, it would change the people's sense of identification with the halakha, and it would create a consensus. So if the problem with that particular group was that it was just a one-time thing, they had more or less already decided, they just came to ask me to give a shiur. But if I was the Rav of their keilah, I would go through a much more, I would go through a more exact and more in-depth process with them. And I would also discuss the policy issues in a deeper way, because for them, I just said it was like just flipping words. It wasn't anything really serious. And I think that's a model that can really work in different versions and for different communities. But I think one of the problems is that halakha has become completely, people are estranged from halakha. But there's another flip side to that, which people like that. They like that because there's something in our era which makes something which is authoritative appealing. Without an exotic, something exotic, like if the Rav says something and it's just completely not understood, it makes people feel good for a couple of reasons. One of them is just because it's exotic. And people feel very bland about their lives. So, wow, I'm doing something. And the other thing is also because of something that came into vogue, which is halakha is about sacrificing yourself, like our father Isaac. That is something, I don't get that at all. I grew up in the Litvish world. We didn't have that when I was growing up. We didn't have that ethos at all. So I come from the Musar movement, the Salmis Vodka. We're meant to enjoy life. Rabak always used to say, whatever you have a halachic question, the first assumption is mutar. Then you have to prove it's asur. I think very often the assumption is that it's asur. I grew up in a different world altogether. I grew up in a world where the Rosh Hashiva took us out for ice cream once a year. And it wasn't a Malava Malke, he just took us out. He was from Mir. He took us out, everybody had black hats except for me, because he thought it would bother my father. My father was a doctor. He just took us out for ice cream. I grew up in a world that was like that. It wasn't so, I think people like to be victims. That's another thing, which I don't get that at all. I don't understand that at all, but I think it's there. So there are a lot of other issues here. So I think there's a way of the way to circumvent that is to have, if the Rav can be on top of it, like people sitting here can be on top of this and can what you would have to, the community would have to decide how exactly. I give a couple of options there of how this model could work. I think it would invigorate the process and make people identify with the decision in the end.
There's a precedent historically for this. I mean, this is the way psak halacha was done in the yeshivot among the Gaonim.
I quoted them in the Yeshiva. In this article, I quoted the Gaonim and some later precedents as well, where they.
And it wasn't the democratic approach. It was having the discussion.
Right.
Among.
There's some poskim who say you should not make any decision without discussing it with others. Yeah. So there you have it. And if there are learned people in the community, why discuss somebody outside the community discuss with the learned people in the community? I think we have an awful lot of people who at least are at the level of the Ramah of the Ramah, who says that a Talmid Chacham is somebody who can find his way around and the material. I think there are many people in our community like that, but there's also many people who can't read anything except in translation.
And the beauty of what you're saying is that it goes against this paternalism that you've been complaining about. And the other side of the paternalism is this infantilization. In other words, communities treated as children, which I think is rampant in some sectors of the Jewish world today. I mean, it just, and the chumrot that you're talking about really, because the poskim don't trust people to make, responsible, informed decisions. So there's a beauty to what you're saying here, though. I think the democratic approach would be a dangerous approach.
I actually gave two models there.
Okay, I want to turn it over to the audience.
Okay. Yes.
Questions?
Oh, but wait. One anecdote was when I was asked about spaying the dog. The fellow had read he was learned, he had read all of the tshuvot over the internet. They were not one-line tshuvot. They were tshuvot that were very well, what's the word? Menumokim heitev.
In depth.
In-depth tshuvot, and he came out completely confused. So he wasn't from my community, so I said to him, I'm willing to get into this issue, but only if our agreement is no matter what I say, it's the final answer. Because you need a final answer. You know all the material, and you know about all the opinions. I will tell you why. I wrote a tshuva explaining why I chose this way. But I said, well, if you can ask me questions, but whatever I say goes, and it's going to be, because otherwise you'll never get out of this. Which also says something about our situation, right? And sometimes people know, that's also my wife taught me when I was very young. People would come to the door with a question, and I would tell them about different possibilities, and I would try to have them participate. So my wife said to me, it's okay sometimes, but a lot of times I'll say it like she says, my wife is, דוד, אתה צריך לעשות איתם חסד, הם רוצים שאתה תקבל את האחריות על ההחלטה. So, they want you to make the decision because they can't. They're so caught up in it. It's such an important issue and they can't do it. So you have to make the decision for them. I think that's all right. That's fine when they need it. But some couples need, or some people asking the question need just the opposite approach. So you have to be very careful with that. Because sometimes you can really, at the first of all, I come from the Big Midrash. I became psak later on. Baal Korchi. So I would tend to give a shiur rather than giving a psika. That's another thing my wife said. They didn't come to hear a shiur. They heard to get a psak. They came to get a psak. So that's another thing. Okay.
So do we
questions?
have questions?
Yes.
So I think I'm not a halachist by any stretch. But I've read a tiny bit. And
Yeah.
It seems that very often there are psak that are specific for a specific time and place and community, and somehow get spread out to the whole world as if it's the right thing for the whole world. And that maybe that's what's also happening in the Haredi world today as well. That there's this, you can't wear slacks because that's like now you're like the secularists and you're going to be disco dancing in 2 seconds from there. So you have to have these very tight ridges. But I guess my main question is I think ultimately you have to be able to reject halakhic opinion as well. You have to say, well, gee, that was written a couple hundred years ago. They were under this persecution there, or there was this threat to the community there, and they made this stringency, but we're not going to keep that stringency, and we're going to follow the leniency. So,
Are we going to handle these one by one? Is that-
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, okay. You have to be careful of that methodology. The reason being that we contextualizing is part of the halachic process. Saying there were circumstances, what the Gemara calls an ukimta, right? Where you say there's a certain specific context. It's part of our process. It was done time and time again. There are 2 things that you have to be careful. One is a very judgmental approach, which says this person, this psak in this generation. I'll give you a good example. It was never done, by the way. The Rambam says that we have to wear a veil in public. Okay, so it could be contextualized, and I think it is contextualized automatically by saying in his society, a woman who didn't wear a veil was making a spectacle of herself, right? But you could say, well, the Rambam was a chauvinist. The judgmental approach is the end of everything, in a certain sense, because if we don't respect the halachic process, we can't respect we won't respect our own decisions because we all have context, and context don't necessarily have anything to do with truth. In other words, Einstein also had a context when he made when he wrote his theory of relativity, and yet it's still true. Now, the fact that there's a context doesn't mean it's not true. So we do use we contextualize things all the time, but we have to be careful with it because just the fact that somebody had a specific context doesn't mean he didn't reach a great truth. So it has to be done very, very carefully. It is done all the time, but it has to be done very, very carefully, and without being judgmental about our predecessors. Not because we could do it academically, but I think in terms of our halachic language, we can't do it that way. In other words, we could say in a shiur that there was a context, but when it comes to psika, you have to contextualize it in a much more delicate fashion. When you judge the halachic, my understanding of Torah Shabbat Peh is that this is also from my mentors, that Rabbi Baxter always used to say, Torah show has a partnership between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Jewish people. There's a human factor here. Human factors will always have context. So if you just poo-poo things because they have a context, you're denying the very nature of the endeavor. The whole idea is that there's a human input into the process. If we're human beings, we have context. We have psychology. We have our own psychic. We have our cultural context. There are a lot of things that come to bear on us. So that's the halachic process. That doesn't mean you can't contextualize, but it has to be done in a delicate fashion without being judgmental about others, because in the end, it means we'll have to be judgmental about ourselves. Which also brings up another problem, which is we as poskim are very much aware of our context, which sometimes can be which can stifle the process. Because if I would think of myself as a feminist when I was writing the tshuva about women singing, I wouldn't have been able to write the tshuva. I tried to neutralize that part of me. I was accused of being a feminist. I don't think that's such a bad accusation, but that's not, I try to work with my, I'm not a purist. I don't believe that there's such a thing as pure halakha, but on the other hand, I don't think the psak should overtly take that into account, and I try to neutralize it when I'm dealing with the issue at hand, because otherwise it's the same kind of judgment towards our predecessors. If I judge myself as I'm going through the process, I won't be able to do anything. So I just try to play it naturally. I try to be as natural as I can. Yes.
Do you worry then that other poskim are not as careful as you are about taking their own opinions? And I mean, we have the same problem politically. People have an opinion, they have a way they feel about something, and they put that into legislation, they put that into law, they put that into halacha, and so perhaps other people are not as careful as you are about taking your, being as neutral, and I think to Roger's point that this is what spreads.
You'll be surprised how careful people are. On the other hand, that is true that does exist where people are not think that their opinion is halakha. That happens, but you would also be surprised how much candor there is and how much people are willing to take criticism. My students once wrote Rav Aviner. We definitely are at difference in many things. They wrote him about a certain issue. He's very strong on issues of sniyut and the relationship between men and women, and all of those issues. He's very strong on those issues, very, very stringent on those issues. And they wrote him that he had made a mistake in one of his books. I won't get into the details now, but he said, you're absolutely right. Look at the new edition that's coming out in the next few weeks. I wrote a chapter to correct the mistake I made. Okay, and that I admire, even though we have a lot of differences, and I mentioned it previously in a negative way. There are a lot of things I don't like about the things he says, but I admire that, and I think very often it happens. By the way, even Moshe Feinstein, there's one tshuva. Moshe Feinstein had the problem with sleeveless dresses. He couldn't figure out why they were asur. So he has this whole, paragraph which he tries to say it's chukat goyim. It's the dress of the non-Jews, okay, which is an isur. And at the end of the paragraph, he says he does something really strange methodologically. And at the end of the paragraph, it says, "V'tzarich iyun gadol uv'chol zot tzarich la'asur." In other words, meaning with great candor, he said it doesn't really work. It doesn't work so well, but I still think it's asur. So there's a lot of honesty out there as well. I would be careful. I would be wary. There are places in which the posek is just opinionated about something and makes it asur because he's sure it should be asur, and he can't fathom any other way, or mutar. By the same token, it could be mutar. It doesn't. So, but still, there's a lot of candor and a lot of self-criticism. Right? That's there as well.
So Bigman, just when you mentioned earlier Slovakia and your experience and the kind of an idea of being mutar, looking for the mutar before the esur and that. I'm wondering if there was other things from your background and from Musar that influenced your derekh psak.
So I have to admit something that it took me a long time to admit. When I came to Israel, I wanted to be more Israeli than the Israelis. But then one of our students from Boston, Sylvia Fishon Barak, sociologist. She said modern Orthodox people have a confusion between American values and halachic values, or Jewish values, or something like that. So I thought of it and I said, oh, that's me. Why is that me? Because my Rosh Yeshiva around Soloveitchik was for civil rights and against the war in Vietnam, for secular education, for B'nai Akiva as well, and Zionists, a bunch of things that are in me. They were in my home. And I think that's why my parents were willing for me to let me go to the Skokie Yeshiva. Because they wouldn't send me to a Black Hat Yeshiva, they would only send me to Skokie. Even later on, I did go to Black Hat Yeshiva, much to my parents' concern. But actually, my father suggested I study with Rabbis, even though there was danger that I might go become Haredi. But those values, I have difficulty differentiating between those values and Torah values. I admit it openly. However, I don't let that interfere with my giving up psak halacha. I try to ignore it. I don't let it. I try to be a purist in a certain sense, even though I know it's there. Obviously, there are a lot of things. For instance, when I was asked to teach women Gemara, my thought was, this is very Litvish, I thought that anybody who doesn't know Torah Sheba'al Peh, doesn't have background in Torah Sheba'al, really isn't Jewish. I hope nobody's offended. So I said, it doesn't make sense for half of the Jewish population not be Jewish. I wouldn't say that today. But that's what I thought when I was 24, 25. That if you don't know Gemara, you don't know anything. You just haven't started it all. So I didn't think it was appropriate. So was that feminist? What was that, civil rights? What was that? But in my own mind, I was just being Litvish. Because I just thought the Gemara was the best thing in the world. So how could you deny half the people Gemara? But there's obviously something else going on there, which I wasn't even aware of at the time. So it's very, very complicated. When Rosh Shmuel Eliyahu said that you can't sell property to non-Jews, so I lectured in a few places, and I showed that it was very difficult to reach that opinion based on the halachic material. Very difficult. It could be done, but you have to really, okay? So when I did that, where was I speaking from? So on the halachic material is quite clear. And I wasn't the only person. Rav Yaakov Aryeh and others also wrote at the same time. Better than Rav Lichtenstein, by the way. I don't know. That's very interesting. Rav Yaakov Aryeh was clearer than Rav Lichtenstein on this issue. And yet, even though I could show that it didn't fit all the Rishonim, it could only fit the Rambam if you didn't understand the Rambam like the Kesef Mishnah. The Kesef Mishnah didn't understand the Rambam that way, but if you wanted to, you could read it into the Rambam, that it related to people who were not of the Avodah Zarah, like the Muslims. There's a way of reading into the Rambam. So what was I? But somewhere in there, was I still back with Martin Luther King? When I thought that, I wasn't the only person who thought it. A lot of people thought, even Rav Yaakov Aryeh thought that. Right? So Rav Yaakov Aryeh wasn't brought up in a liberal American home. So I don't know. I'm not sure exactly, but I don't think I'm any worse than any other of the other poskim. Every posek has background and it's legitimate, and I just go. I just play it naturally, as naturally as I can.
I think last question. Do we have a last question?
No more questions?
There's a lot more.
Must be boring. Okay,
I think it's since the Rav has been up since 3 a.m. and it's already 10, but this has been a tremendously stimulating conversation. I mean, full of honesty and candor and depth. We're very grateful to Bigman.
I want to thank you, the Kahal, and the Rabbanim, for asking me questions I still have to think about, which I like always. And I think serious issues have been brought up here that I don't really have so many people to talk about these issues to. I very often think that people are not willing to talk about the methodological issues, and maybe we should get together a think tank to think about these issues more in depth.
Very exciting.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Vince, we have three down. Just